August 19th, 1944. The proving grounds at Isigny, Normandy. American ordnance officers gathered around a captured Panther tank, its German cross still visible beneath a hasty coat of Allied olive drab. Lieutenant Colonel James Taylor steadied his binoculars as the 76mm Sherman prepared to fire from 1,000 yards. The crew loaded one of the precious new rounds that had arrived by air from the United States just days earlier, rounds marked with distinctive black paint and white lettering that read HVAP-T M93. What happened in the next 3 seconds would fundamentally alter American confidence in armored warfare. The tungsten carbide core, traveling at over 3,400 feet per second, struck the Panther's gun mantlet with a sharp metallic crack that echoed across the test range. Where standard ammunition had consistently bounced off or shattered against German armor for months, this round punched cleanly through 100mm of hardened steel, detonating the ammunition stored directly behind the breech. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The psychological impact of watching American 76mm guns defeat what had been considered invulnerable armor would ripple through both Allied and German armored forces for the remainder of the war. But the story of how specialized ammunition transformed American tank crews from uncertain defenders into confident attackers begins not with this dramatic test, but with a crisis of confidence that had been building since the first Panthers appeared in the bocage. Early 1944 found American armored doctrine confronting a problem that pre-war planning had failed to anticipate. The M4 Sherman, designed as a general-purpose medium tank capable of infantry support and armored warfare, was encountering German tanks it could not reliably defeat from any angle at combat ranges. The Panther, Germany's response to the Soviet 34, combined a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun with sloped frontal armor that created effective protection exceeding 140mm against projectiles fired at typical combat angles. American intelligence estimates had catastrophically underestimated both the quantity and capability of Panthers that would be deployed. Before D-Day, intelligence predicted encountering perhaps a few dozen of these advanced tanks. By June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the Normandy beaches, 38% of German tanks in the theatre were Panthers. Not the handful anticipated, but hundreds of these formidable vehicles that could destroy Shermans from ranges exceeding 2,000 yards while remaining effectively immune to return fire. The 75mm M3 gun that armed the majority of Sherman's landing in Normandy could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any practical range. Crews watched in frustration as their armor-piercing rounds struck the sloped glacis plate and ricocheted harmlessly into the French countryside, leaving the Sherman vulnerable to devastating return fire from the Panther's powerful gun that could punch through Sherman armor from distances where American tanks could barely identify their targets. The improved 76mm M1 gun, which American ordnance had been developing since 1942, offered only marginal improvement with standard ammunition. Using conventional M62 armor-piercing capped rounds, the 76mm gun could penetrate approximately 109mm of armor at 1,000 yards when striking perpendicular to the surface. This proved sufficient against Panzer IVs and many German assault guns, but the Panther's sloped frontal armor, presenting effective thickness far exceeding the gun's penetration capability, remained essentially immune to frontal engagement. Sherman crews learned through bitter experience that they could potentially penetrate the Panther's gun mantlet, but only at suicidal ranges typically under 100 yards, distances at which the Panther's superior firepower made survival unlikely. The tactical dilemma was stark. American doctrine emphasized mobility and combined arms coordination, but when facing Panthers, Sherman crews had to choose between attempting desperate close-range flanking maneuvers or calling for artillery and air support, conceding the immediate tactical initiative to an enemy who could engage with impunity from protected positions. The deployment of the 76mm gun itself represented a saga of bureaucratic hesitation and belated recognition of battlefield realities. The first M4 Shermans mounting the longer, more powerful gun rolled off American production lines in January 1944. These M4 A176 Shermans reached Britain on April 10, 1944, with 130 tanks delivered in preparation for the Normandy invasion that would commence 2 months later. Despite their availability and the known limitations of the 75mm gun against advanced German armor, American commanders refused to deploy these improved tanks on D-Day. The reasoning reflected multiple concerns. Crews lacked adequate training time on the new weapon system, having spent months preparing with 75mm guns. Logistical planners worried about maintaining 2 different ammunition types across supply networks that were already strained, supporting the largest amphibious operation in military history. Most critically, senior commanders believed the standard 75mm gun would prove adequate for expected opposition. This calculation, based on intelligence estimates that proved wildly inaccurate regarding both Panther quantities and capabilities, would cost American tank crews dearly in the difficult fighting through Normandy's hedge-lined countryside. By early July 1944, field reports from units engaged in the brutal bocage fighting painted a grim picture of American inadequacy against German armor. Tank crews reported Panthers positioned in hull-down defensive positions, exposing only their heavily armored turrets, while their powerful guns commanded long sight lines through gaps in the hedgerows. On July 2nd, complaints about the 75mm gun's ineffectiveness against Panthers reached General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. His response, documented by multiple witnesses and recorded in historical accounts, captured the command-level frustration with ordnance assurances that had proven tragically optimistic. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out?" Eisenhower reportedly said, his voice rising. "Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war." The full exchange, as recorded by officers present, continued with stronger language, expressing his anger that ordnance officials had assured him the 76mm would take care of anything the Germans fielded. The disconnect between Ordnance Department testing using perpendicular impacts against flat armor plates and battlefield reality involving sloped armor and oblique angles had created dangerous overconfidence in American capabilities. A board convened on July 12, 1944, officially determined what tank crews had known from painful experience since encountering their first Panthers. Standard American tank weapons, including the improved 76mm gun-firing conventional ammunition, could not defeat Panther armor from frontal aspects at normal combat ranges. General Omar Bradley immediately ordered 76mm Shermans rushed from British staging areas to frontline units desperate for improved firepower. On July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive from the Normandy beachhead, 102 M4, a 176 tanks made their combat debut. The initial engagement reports were sobering. While the 76mm represented a meaningful improvement over the 75mm, it still struggled against Panther frontal armor at typical combat ranges. Sherman crews quickly learned they needed to maneuver for flank shots, targeting the thinner side armor, or attempt to hit the Panther's gun mantlet at dangerously close ranges. Neither tactical option proved desirable when facing tanks that could destroy Shermans from 2,000 yards away. The solution to this tactical crisis lay not in larger guns or thicker armor, but in metallurgy and physics applied to ammunition design. By July 1944, American ordnance engineers working under intense pressure had developed a projectile that would fundamentally alter the tactical calculus. The T4 round, later standardized as the M93 HVAP, represented a radical departure from conventional armor-piercing ammunition design that dated to the earliest days of armored warfare. High-velocity armor-piercing ammunition embodied principles that seemed counterintuitive to traditional ordnance thinking. The projectile consisted of a tungsten carbide core, one of the hardest materials available to wartime industry, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and ballistic windshield. This design concentrated the projectile's kinetic energy into a smaller, denser penetrator while reducing overall weight allowing significantly higher muzzle velocities than conventional steel projectiles of equivalent caliber. The physics were elegant in their simplicity. Armor penetration depends fundamentally on kinetic energy delivered to a small impact area. A denser, harder penetrator traveling at higher velocity delivers more energy per unit of impact surface, overwhelming the structural integrity of armor steel that could resist larger, slower projectiles. The tungsten carbide core, with density exceeding steel by substantial margins, retained kinetic energy over distance far better than conventional penetrators, maintaining lethal effectiveness at ranges where standard ammunition had proven ineffective. The performance improvement was dramatic and immediately measurable. The M93 HVAP round achieved muzzle velocities of 1,036 meters per second, compared to 792 meters per second for standard M62 armor-piercing rounds. This 244 meter per second velocity increase translated directly into penetrating power that transformed the 76mm gun's tactical utility. At 1,000 yards, approximately 914 meters, the HVAP round could penetrate 178 millimeters of armor when striking perpendicular to the surface. Against the Panther's gun mantlet, constructed of curved cast steel 100 millimeters thick on early models and increased to 120 millimeters on later production variants, this meant reliable penetration at ranges up to 1,000 yards instead of point-blank distances under 100 yards. The mantlet, previously a target that required suicidal approaches under direct enemy fire, suddenly became vulnerable at ranges where Sherman crews could engage with reasonable prospects of survival. But developing revolutionary ammunition represented only half the solution to American armored warfare problems. Production at the scale necessary to equip frontline units presented challenges that would limit HVAP effectiveness throughout the remainder of the European war. The fundamental constraint was tungsten carbide availability, governed by geopolitics and competing industrial priorities that ordnance planners could not easily overcome. Tungsten carbide production depended on tungsten ore, a strategic material imported primarily from China, which produced 36% of global tungsten supply before the war disrupted traditional trade patterns. Tungsten was critical to numerous war industries beyond ammunition production. Machine tools required tungsten carbide cutting edges to manufacture everything from aircraft engines to artillery barrels. Armor plate production used tungsten to create hardened steel that resisted penetration. Various industrial processes across the war economy competed for limited tungsten supplies that could never satisfy total demand. American tungsten demand for HVAP ammunition alone consumed hundreds of metric tons annually, tonnage that had to be balanced against other critical needs. Each 76mm HVAP round contained approximately 0.88 kilograms of tungsten carbide, meaning a Sherman carrying the standard load of 6 rounds required nearly 5 kilograms of this scarce material. When thousands of tanks needed equipping, and each tank ideally required not just 6 rounds but dozens to sustain combat operations, the resource limitations became starkly apparent. China produced approximately 10,000 metric tons of tungsten concentrates in 1944, but this entire output had to serve Allied needs across all applications and all theaters of war. The United States supplemented Chinese imports with domestic production from limited deposits in Colorado, Nevada, and California, but total availability remained constrained by geology and mining capacity that could not be rapidly expanded despite urgent military requirements. Germany's tungsten position was far worse, with Swedish imports declining sharply as the war turned against the Reich, and neutral Sweden became increasingly reluctant to support the Nazi war machine. German domestic tungsten production remained minimal throughout the war. By 1945, German factories desperately hoarded tungsten for machine tools needed for aircraft engine production, while Panther crews received only standard ammunition, creating an ironic situation where German tanks with superior armor protection lacked the specialized ammunition to exploit their advantages. The United States Ordnance Department had been conducting HVAP projectile testing since spring 1942, but production at meaningful scale did not begin until after the Normandy landings revealed the full extent of the Panther problem. The production ramp-up schedule illustrated the industrial challenges involved in manufacturing specialized ammunition, requiring scarce strategic materials and precision assembly. In July 1944, production of 3-inch HVAP rounds for tank destroyers reached 1,000 rounds total. August saw 1,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP produced. September yielded another 1,076mm rounds. Not until November 1944 did monthly production reach 5,000 rounds for the 76mm gun, ramping to 7,000 rounds per month by January 1945. By March 1945, approximately 33,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition had been produced since the program began. This represented significant industrial effort and resource allocation, but remained a fraction of what frontline units desperately needed. By February 1945, after months of production and distribution, the average 76mm Sherman in Europe had received a total of 5 HVAP rounds. 5 rounds to face an enemy deploying Panthers as standard equipment in Panzer divisions. A Sherman company with 17 tanks would possess 85 HVAP rounds total, while potentially facing German units that might field 30 or more Panthers in a single engagement. The scarcity created agonizing prioritization decisions at multiple command levels. Tank destroyer battalions, whose doctrinal mission focused specifically on anti-tank combat, received preferential allocation of HVAP ammunition. Sherman tanks, fulfilling dual roles of infantry support and armored warfare, often received fewer rounds despite encountering enemy tanks more frequently than specialized tank destroyer units that were supposed to be held in reserve for counter-attacking enemy armor breakthroughs. This allocation system, managed through multiple layers of command from army level down to battalion, resulted in frustrating inefficiencies. Some units received more HVAP ammunition than they could immediately employ, the rounds sitting in supply dumps, while neighboring units exhausted their meager allocations within days and received no resupply despite urgent requests transmitted up the chain of command. The first HVAP rounds reached the European theatre in August 1944, arriving by air transport to ensure rapid delivery for the Isigny testing program. Those initial 1,000 rounds, split between 76mm and 3-inch ammunition, were rushed to Normandy, where captured German armour provided ideal targets for systematic evaluation. The testing confirmed what ballistic calculations had predicted. HVAP ammunition could defeat Panther mantlets at 1,000 yards when hits were achieved on the curved cast steel surface. The portion of ammunition remaining after testing was immediately issued to frontline units, but arrival of these revolutionary rounds was overshadowed by broader tactical problems confronting American armored forces. The Normandy bocage had forced American armor into close-quarters combat, where superior German guns could ambush Sherman columns from concealed positions in the hedge-lined fields. Tank crews faced an enemy who had learned to position Panthers in hull-down emplacements, exposing only the heavily armored turret while keeping the more vulnerable hull hidden behind earthen berms or hedgerows. German defensive doctrine emphasized first-shot capability, with Panthers waiting in carefully prepared positions that allowed Sherman columns to approach before opening devastating fire from ranges where American return fire remained, largely ineffective, even with improved ammunition. The psychological impact on American tank crews, already shaken by encounters with invulnerable German armor, was severe and persistent. Crews had nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson lighter, claiming it lit on fire every time, after the cigarette lighter company's advertising slogan. While post-war analysis would show this reputation was significantly exaggerated, comparing Sherman fire rates favorably against other tanks, including German designs, the perception shaped battlefield behavior in ways that handed tactical initiative to the enemy. Tank commanders who spotted Panthers often chose to call for artillery support or airstrikes rather than engage directly with their main guns, even after HVAP ammunition became available. This reluctance, born from months of watching standard ammunition bounce ineffectively off German armor, took time to overcome despite the improved capabilities that HVAP represented. Training on proper HVAP employment was minimal, as the ammunition reached frontline units faster than training materials could be developed and distributed. Many crews learned effective employment techniques through trial and error under actual combat conditions, sometimes with tragic results. The first widespread combat test of HVAP ammunition effectiveness came not in Normandy's claustrophobic bocage, but in the more open terrain of Lorraine, where American armored divisions had broken out from the confines of the hedgerow country into rolling farmland that favored mobile armored warfare. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. September 1944 found Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army deep in France, racing toward the German border, with logistics stretched to breaking points as supply lines extended hundreds of miles from Normandy beaches. The 4th Armored Division, one of the most effective American armored formations with a reputation for aggressive tactics and innovative combined arms coordination, had advanced rapidly, through light German resistance, seizing a crucial bridgehead over the Moselle River near Aracourt. German High Command recognized the strategic threat this penetration represented. If Patton's armor reached the Rhine River and crossed into Germany proper, the industrial heartland of the Reich would be exposed to Allied advances. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army received explicit orders to counterattack, destroy the American bridgehead, and push back Patton's advance before it could threaten German territory. The German force assembled for this counterattack included 2 newly formed Panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, equipped primarily with Panther tanks fresh from German factories and crewed by soldiers who had minimal training on their sophisticated vehicles. On paper, examining only raw numbers and technical specifications, the German advantage appeared overwhelming and likely to produce a decisive victory that would at minimum stall Patton's advance and potentially create opportunity for a broader German counteroffensive. The 2 Panzer brigades together fielded approximately 150 tanks against Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, which possessed roughly 50 Sherman tanks. The 113th Panzer Brigade alone entered battle with approximately 90 tanks and assault guns across both battalions, including 42 Panthers and 40 Panzer IVs. German planners, examining these force ratios and confident in the technical superiority of their Panthers over American Shermans, anticipated a rapid victory that would demonstrate continued German tactical prowess, despite increasingly unfavorable strategic circumstances. The Panthers' technical superiority, they calculated, should compensate for any American advantages in logistics, artillery support, or air power, advantages that German intelligence recognized, but commanders consistently underestimated in their operational planning. They were fundamentally and catastrophically mistaken in these calculations. The Battle of Aracourt, fought over 11 brutal days from September 18th to 29th, would become the largest sustained tank engagement fought by American forces until the Battle of the Bulge 3 months later. More importantly for the development of American armored doctrine, it would demonstrate conclusively that American tank crews, properly trained and equipped with HVAP ammunition and supported by coordinated artillery and air power, could defeat technically superior German armor through tactical excellence and combined arms integration. The morning of September 19th began with thick fog blanketing the rolling agricultural terrain around Aracourt, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards, and creating conditions that negated the Panthers' advantages in long-range gunnery. German reconnaissance capabilities were severely limited by the weather conditions and by the Panzer Brigade's fundamental lack of proper scout units, an organizational deficiency that would prove costly as the battle developed. The Panzer Brigades advanced blindly into terrain held by American forces, who knew the ground intimately and had established carefully prepared defensive positions that exploited natural cover and fields of fire. At approximately 8 in the morning, elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade penetrated American outposts east and south of Aracourt. The German tanks, factory-new Panthers crewed by inexperienced soldiers who had received only weeks of training, moved forward in column formation, along roads and trails, a fundamental tactical error that veteran American tankers immediately recognized and exploited. Captain Kenneth Lameson's Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion held defensive positions along key approaches to Aracourt. His Sherman crews had been thoroughly briefed on the HVAP rounds loaded in their ammunition racks, 6 precious rounds per tank that represented their best chance against Panther armor. The briefings had emphasized careful shot selection and range discipline. Use them wisely against Panther turrets or mantlets, at ranges where velocity remains sufficient for reliable penetration. Don't waste these scarce rounds on targets that standard ammunition could defeat, or at ranges where the tungsten carbide core might shatter on impact, rather than penetrating. The fog that hindered German reconnaissance and coordination now worked decisively in favor of American defenders who knew the terrain and had prepared firing positions that commanded the limited visibility corridors through the mist. A section of Lamisson's Shermans occupied carefully selected positions south of Aracourt village when the first Panther materialized from the fog like a grey ghost, barely 75 yards away from the concealed American tanks. At this extremely close range, the Panther's superior long-range gunnery capability meant nothing. Engagement time was measured in seconds, success determined by which crew identified the target first and fired fastest. The American gunner, trained through months of combat experience and countless dry-fire drills, reacted instantly. The HVAP round, traveling at over 1,000 meters per second, crossed the short distance almost instantaneously. The tungsten carbide core struck the Panther's gun mantlet with tremendous kinetic energy focused on a small impact area. The hardened penetrator punched through the curved cast steel that had been designed to deflect conventional projectiles, continuing through the armor and detonating the ammunition stored in racks directly beneath the gun breech. The Panther exploded from internal overpressure, its turret lifting visibly from the hull as secondary detonations consumed the vehicle in flames and smoke. 2 more Panthers emerged from the fog in quick succession, following their destroyed comrade in column formation, that exposed each vehicle to American fire as they advanced. Both were destroyed within seconds by HVAP rounds fired from concealed positions, their crews having no opportunity to effectively return fire in the limited visibility that had reduced the engagement to point-blank range, where American training and prepared positions provided decisive advantages. The remaining German tanks in the column, crews shocked by the sudden catastrophic loss of 3 Panthers to what they had been repeatedly told were inferior American tanks with inadequate guns, turned away from the engagement and withdrew into the fog. Throughout the morning of September 19th, similar engagements erupted across the Aracourt sector as German forces probed American defensive positions. American tanks, using the fog as concealment rather than hindrance, engaged Panthers at ranges where HVAP rounds proved devastatingly effective against mantlets and turret faces. The German tactical deployment, advancing in columns without proper reconnaissance or combined arms support, proved disastrous against defenders who understood how to exploit limited visibility and prepared positions. Near Aracourt's forward command post, a platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, also equipped with 76mm guns and HVAP ammunition, engaged German armor at close range with spectacular results. The fast-moving Hellcats, capable of speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour on roads, proved devastatingly effective in the close-range fog-shrouded combat, using their superior mobility to engage from unexpected angles and quickly reposition after firing. By midday, as the fog began lifting, American forward artillery observers gained clear sight lines across the rolling terrain. Coordinated fire missions rained high-explosive shells on German armor concentrations, destroying or damaging vehicles and disrupting tactical coordination. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers of the 405th Fighter Group arrived overhead as visibility improved, diving through gaps in the dissipating fog to strike German armor with rockets, bombs, and heavy machine gun fire that, while rarely penetrating armor, killed exposed crew members and damaged optics, tracks, and weapons systems. The combination of American advantages became starkly apparent to German commanders monitoring the battle's progress. While individual Panthers possessed superior armor protection and firepower compared to individual Shermans in isolated technical comparisons, American forces employed combined arms tactics as standard doctrine across all organizational levels. German tanks advanced without adequate artillery support, Without air cover that had long since been swept from European skies by Allied fighter superiority, and without infantry to clear American defensive positions or protect German armor from close-range anti-tank weapons. American forces, by contrast, coordinated armor with artillery fire that could be called within minutes, air power that arrived overhead within hours, infantry equipped with bazookas and anti-tank mines, and tank destroyers positioned to cover key approaches. This integrated system, practiced and refined through months of combat operations, overwhelmed German technical advantages in individual weapon systems. When Panthers encountered these prepared combined arms defenses, they were destroyed piecemeal, despite their impressive specifications, victims of tactical doctrine that emphasized coordination over individual technical superiority. The HVAP ammunition did not make Sherman tanks equal to Panthers in pure technical specifications, comparing armor thickness, gun power, or mobility on paper. But armored warfare is not conducted according to technical specifications reviewed in comfortable offices. Tanks are destroyed by crews who identify vulnerabilities and exploit them under chaotic combat conditions, where training, coordination, and tactical awareness matter as much as armor thickness or gun caliber. The Panther's gun mantlet, necessary to allow the 75mm gun to elevate and traverse across its engagement arc, created a structural weak point that skilled gunners could target. The junction between turret and hull, the side armor that was substantially thinner than frontal protection, the engine deck vulnerable to top attack, all represented targets that HVAP-equipped Shermans could now engage successfully at combat ranges that previously had been suicidal to attempt. More devastating to German tactical effectiveness and crew morale than the physical penetrations was the psychological impact of discovering their armor was no longer effectively invulnerable to American fire. Panther crews had been trained explicitly to believe their tanks could not be penetrated frontally by American guns. Intelligence briefings distributed through German units emphasized the Sherman's inadequate firepower and assured crews that as long as they kept their frontal armor toward the enemy, they remained safe from American tank fire. The first Panther commanders to watch Sherman rounds punch through their mantlets and detonate ready ammunition stored in the turret, assuming they survived the catastrophic explosions that resulted from penetrations, igniting propellant charges, learned otherwise in the most traumatic way possible. Survivors of such encounters, evacuating from destroyed or disabled vehicles, carried that devastating knowledge back to their units, spreading awareness through informal channels that American tanks now possessed ammunition capable of defeating Panthers under favorable circumstances. By the afternoon of September 19th, German tank commanders across the Arakourt sector were reporting to higher headquarters that American Shermans possessed new, significantly more powerful ammunition. The reports were confused, contradictory, and reflected the chaos of battlefield information gathering. Some claimed the Americans had secretly deployed tank destroyers, mounting 90mm guns that had previously been scarce. Others suggested the British had provided 17-pounder Firefly tanks to American units, mixing British and American armor in combined formations. The truth, that American industry had developed specialized tungsten carbide ammunition that partially negated the Panther's carefully engineered armor advantages, proved more troubling to German strategic planners than any of these theories, when accurate intelligence finally reached higher command levels. It meant that American industrial capacity could identify tactical problems, develop technical solutions, and field them to combat units faster than German industry could develop effective counters, a realization that had profound implications for the war's eventual outcome. The fighting continued through September 22nd when the major German offensive efforts finally collapsed under the weight of sustained American combined arms defense. American forces had destroyed or disabled approximately 86 German tanks and assault guns across the 11-day battle. American losses stood at 25 Sherman tanks and 7 tank destroyers, a kill ratio that heavily favored the defenders, despite their documented technical disadvantage in individual tank performance specifications. The Battle of Arakourt represented not merely a tactical victory that secured Patton's bridgehead, but a psychological watershed that would influence armored warfare doctrine for the remainder of the European campaign. American tank crews learned definitively that they could defeat Panthers without waiting for specialized tank destroyer units or overwhelming air support to arrive. The availability of HVAP ammunition, though critically limited, provided a capability that transformed crew confidence and tactical aggressiveness. German crews, conversely, lost the psychological security of believing in absolute frontal invulnerability that had sustained their morale through increasingly desperate defensive battles. The realization that American tanks could penetrate Panther armor under favorable circumstances fundamentally altered German tactical calculations and forced more cautious, defensive postures that surrendered initiative to American forces who could afford to take calculated risks. The German perspective on Aracourt was characterized by confusion and bitter recrimination among commanders seeking explanations for the catastrophic defeat. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had entered battle with approximately 90 operational tanks and assault guns, could muster fewer than 20 serviceable vehicles by September 29th. Maintenance issues, mechanical breakdowns, and combat losses had effectively destroyed the unit as a fighting formation within less than 2 weeks of combat operations. German after-action reports struggled to explain how newly produced Panthers, technically superior to American tanks by every measurable specification, had been defeated so comprehensively by what German intelligence consistently characterized as inferior American armor. The technical superiority of the Panther remained undeniable when examining armor thickness, gun penetration, and mobility specifications on paper. How then had inexperienced crews in these sophisticated machines been systematically destroyed by American forces? The answers lay partly in fundamental disparities in training and tactical experience that German planners had failed to adequately account for in their operational planning. The Panzer Brigade crews had received minimal training, often arriving at the front with only weeks of instruction on their vehicles and almost no combined arms training. American tank crews in the 4th Armored Division were combat veterans who had fought across France, understood combined arms warfare through extensive experience, and had learned to exploit terrain for tactical advantage through months of sustained operations. But training and experience alone did not fully explain Panther losses, particularly the penetrations through frontal armor that should not have been possible with standard American ammunition, according to German ballistic testing and intelligence assessments. German intelligence officers, examining destroyed Panthers in the aftermath of Aracourt, found entry holes smaller than expected for 76mm projectiles, suggesting sub-caliber penetrators rather than full-bore rounds. Examination of unexploded rounds recovered near disabled tanks revealed the troubling truth that German strategic planners had been reluctant to face. The Americans had deployed tungsten carbide ammunition in quantities sufficient to distribute to frontline tank units, not merely to specialized anti-tank formations. This discovery carried profound strategic implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Germany itself had developed similar tungsten core ammunition, the Panzer Granit 40 series, which used tungsten carbide to achieve improved penetration against heavily armored Soviet tanks. But German tungsten supplies were critically limited by late 1944, with production increasingly focused on machine tools rather than ammunition, as industrial priorities shifted under pressure of strategic bombing and raw material shortages. If Americans could field specialized tungsten carbide ammunition in quantities sufficient to equip standard tank units with multiple rounds per vehicle, it demonstrated industrial capacity and resource access that Germany fundamentally could not match, regardless of technical knowledge or engineering expertise. Not only were American tanks more numerous and better supported logistically, they were now equipped with ammunition that partially negated Germany's carefully engineered technical advantages in armor protection that had required years of development and enormous industrial investment. The impact of HVAP ammunition extended beyond immediate tactical results at Aracourt to influence American armored force psychology across the European theater. As knowledge spread through tank battalions that the new ammunition could defeat Panthers under favorable circumstances, crews became measurably more willing to engage German armor directly, rather than immediately calling for support from other arms or attempting to disengage. the psychological paralysis that had affected some American units during the difficult Normandy fighting, where encounters with invulnerable German armor had created reluctance to engage, it began dissipating as HVAP ammunition became more widely distributed and crews gained confidence through successful engagements. Tank crews still respected the Panther's formidable capabilities and understood the risks involved in armored combat, but no longer felt helpless when encountering German heavy tanks. This shift in crew morale and tactical confidence proved crucial for subsequent operations as American forces advanced toward Germany. A crew that believes it possesses effective weapons and can fight successfully will engage aggressively, seeking advantageous positions and taking calculated risks to achieve tactical objectives. A crew that believes it is hopelessly outmatched will hesitate, avoid contact when possible, and surrender initiative to the enemy, creating tactical paralysis that no amount of numerical superiority can fully compensate for in mobile warfare. HVAP ammunition, though remaining in critically short supply throughout the remainder of the European campaign, provided American tankers with a weapon that allowed them to fight Panthers on more tactically equal terms despite persistent technical disadvantages. Even crews that had never personally fired an HVAP round benefited psychologically from knowing the ammunition existed and might become available when most desperately needed. A confidence factor that influenced tactical decision-making and unit morale. Commanders were forced to make agonizing prioritization decisions with the perpetually limited HVAP supply. Tank destroyer battalions, whose doctrinal mission focused specifically on anti-tank combat, received preferential allocation, despite Sherman tanks encountering enemy armor more frequently in their dual role supporting infantry operations. The allocation system, managed across multiple command levels from Army headquarters down to battalion supply officers, resulted in persistent inefficiencies, where some units accumulated unused HVAP rounds, while neighboring formations exhausted their supply within days of heavy fighting. When German forces launched their surprise Ardennes offensive in December 1944, American tank units faced renewed intense pressure from hundreds of Panthers and Tiger tanks deployed in winter conditions that favored defensive fighting and limited Allied air superiority through weeks of poor weather. The Battle of the Bulge saw American Sherman crews relying heavily on their scarce HVAP ammunition to engage German heavy armor that had been carefully husbanded for this final major German offensive in the West. The shortage became critical within days, as heavy fighting consumed stockpiled ammunition faster than supply networks could deliver replacements through snow-blocked roads disrupted by German advances. Some units exhausted their HVAP supply completely and found resupply requests going unfulfilled as the logistical crisis threatened to undermine American defensive efforts. Yet even during the desperate fighting, American forces demonstrated that tactical skill and combined arms coordination could compensate for technical disadvantage, with tank crews coordinating closely with infantry bazooka teams and artillery forward observers to defeat German armor. By early 1945, the strategic picture had shifted decisively in Allied favor, despite the Bulge fighting. American and British forces prepared to cross the Rhine, while Soviet armies advanced relentlessly from the east. Germany's industrial capacity collapsed under strategic bombing, territorial losses, and severe raw material shortages, including fuel and tungsten. Panther production fell sharply as factories were destroyed and transportation networks disrupted. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, provided final vindication for HVAP effectiveness when abundant supplies became available. American Sherman tanks, equipped with 76mm guns, faced Soviet-built 34-85 tanks in North Korean and Chinese service. Unlike Europe, where HVAP had been desperately scarce, Korean operations enjoyed plentiful ammunition stocks no longer constrained by competing wartime demands. Sherman crews found HVAP rounds easily penetrated 34-85 armor at normal combat ranges, achieving remarkably favorable exchange ratios. The 76mm Sherman's success in Korea was bittersweet for European theater veterans. The ammunition that could have been more widely employed against Panthers proved devastatingly effective when supply constraints no longer limited tactical employment. American industry's solution to the armor penetration problem developed under pressure in 1944, had been fundamentally sound. The limitation had been tungsten scarcity, not technical capability, a distinction that mattered profoundly to crews who had fought Panthers with inadequate ammunition supplies. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.